Man is by nature a political animal.
Hmm. Powerful stuff. It makes you think, doesn't it? I mean, Aristotle really hit the nail on the head with that one, all the way back in politics. And it's so relevant even today,
Yeah.
especially when we look at something as complex and fundamental as, well, a nation's constitution.
Right. Like, how do these ancient ideas about, like, our inherent need for some kind of political order, how does that actually play out in a modern structure?
Exactly. It's a question that keeps coming back to me, especially with the material you sent over on Pakistan's constitution. We're going deep on that today.
It's a great choice for a deep dive. Constitutions are fascinating, really. Like, where those big philosophical ideas about how society should work, they collide head on with the messy reality of actually governing people.
Totally. So for this session, we're strapping on our political science goggles, right? And we're taking a close look at Pakistan's constitution. And, I mean, we're not just going to skim the surface here.
Oh, no.
We're going in deep.
Yeah. We're talking foundational principles, the whole scope of issues it covers, how it connects to other fields, like law, obviously, but also sociology, economics, history, and of course its impact in the real world. We'll be pulling in insights from a bunch of political thinkers, applying their ideas to Pakistan's specific context. And a big shout out to law student Farman Ali Ujjan, whose perspective is really informing our discussion today.
It's like we're treating Pakistan's constitution as this living, breathing case study, a real-world experiment in, like, how to build a political system.
Exactly. All right, so roadmap time. We're going to start at the very beginning. Why do societies even bother with systems of government in the first place? And how are those reasons reflected in Pakistan's constitution? Then we'll zoom out a little and look at political science itself. How does it help us analyze the way power works in Pakistan today? After that, we'll untangle the relationship between political science and all those other social sciences I mentioned, because trust me, those connections are way more intertwined than you might think. And finally, we'll look at some concrete examples, like major court decisions and international treaties. They really illustrate those political science principles in action, the big picture. To see Pakistan's constitution not just as a bunch of laws written down, but as this dynamic, evolving expression of political science constantly in motion. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. Where do we even begin to see these, big ideas about governance reflected in Pakistan's constitution?
Well, going back to Aristotle and his whole political animal thing, right? It suggests that we're practically hardwired to create order, figure out what's good for us, what's bad for us as a community. And that inherent need, that's the foundation of any political system. Now look at the preamble to Pakistan's 1973 constitution. It says that while sovereignty belongs to Allah, the authority to govern is actually given to the people, within certain limits, of course. It's super interesting. You see this attempt to ground the legitimacy of the government in a higher power, but also acknowledge the idea of, like, popular consent.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope, trying to balance these lofty ideals of divine justice with, the down and dirty reality of actually running a country. Makes me think of Machiavelli, his whole realism thing, where he says pursuing virtue can actually lead to ruin if not everyone's playing by the same rules. How does that tension play out in Pakistan's story, especially given its founding and the whole journey of its constitution?
Oh, that's huge. And Udeshan's perspective really brings this home. The Constitution wasn't drafted in some ivory tower.
Hmm.
The 1971 crisis, the separation of East Pakistan, that injected a heavy dose of pragmatism, consolidation, securing authority, protecting the country, all that. So while the preamble is all about ideals, the nuts and bolts of the government, how power is actually divided up, it reflects these more, well, Machiavellian concerns about survival, keeping the state intact.
Right, right. And speaking of balancing acts, we have to talk about the objectives resolution. It's like a cornerstone of the Constitution, and it tries to blend Islamic principles with, these democratic aspirations. From a political science perspective, what can you tell us about the successes, the challenges of trying to bring these seemingly different ideas about legitimacy together?
It's super insightful to analyze this through different lenses. Like sociologically, it taps into that fundamental need for social order. Aristotle was touching on that. It's like the Constitution is trying to create a framework for that order, but it's also deeply infused with religious and cultural values specific to Pakistan. Then there's a criminological perspective. The Constitution lays out how to deal with actions that deviate from that established order. On the economic side, just the act of creating a state and a system of governance has huge implications for things like resource allocation, economic policies, the whole shebang. And legally, obviously, the Constitution becomes the supreme law of the land, the basis for every other law and how courts interpret them. So you've got all these fields kind of grappling with the implications of this unique blend of divine and democratic legitimacy. It's woven right into Pakistan's DNA, so to speak.
Wow. It's not just a political document. It's a mirror reflecting these deeply ingrained social norms, economic realities, and historical experiences. And all of that is filtered through this idea of creating a just and stable political order. It's fascinating. Okay, so we've touched on the foundation. Now let's broaden our view a bit. Talk about the scope of political science itself. How does it equip us to understand how power is actually distributed in Pakistan today? Because we all know it goes way beyond just what's written in the Constitution.
Oh, absolutely. It's like Harold Walensky said, political science is all about the lives of people in relation to organized states. The focus is on power, plain and simple. How do you get it?
Yeah.
How do you use it? And, crucially, how is it spread out? Robert Dahl added another layer to this. He asked this provocative question. In a system where almost everyone can vote, but things like knowledge, wealth, social status are all unevenly distributed, who really holds the reins? And that question is especially relevant in Pakistan, wouldn't you say?
It really is. On paper, Pakistan has this democratic system. Elections, representative institutions, all that. But if you look closer, you see these massive influences that aren't explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. Huge land holdings, powerful social networks, the historical role of the military. How does political science help us break down these, let's say, less formal but very real power dynamics?
That's where the tools of political science become really powerful. Like Ujjan makes this great point about how Dahl's question about unequal resources, it ripples across all these different social sciences. Economic disparities, well, that takes us straight to the study of wealth inequality in economics. Social standing and networks, that's sociology territory. Criminology comes in when you look at how power can be abused, leading to corruption, the suppression of rights, all that. And public administration is all about how the government manages and distributes resources, which, let's face it, often reflects existing power imbalances. Political science gives us the framework to understand how all these forces interact, how they shape the way power actually plays out, even if it doesn't always match up with what's written in the Constitution.
It brings up that age-old debate. Is political science purely descriptive, just explaining how power works, or does it have this normative side, suggesting how power should be structured to better serve the people? It seems like Pakistan's constitution itself is trying to bridge that gap. It lays out this ideal framework, but it's constantly being challenged by the realities of power on the ground.
There's this ongoing tug of war. And the 1973 Constitution, with its articles on the parliamentary system, the federal structure, it tries to lay out this formal distribution of power. Article 17, guaranteeing freedom of association, that's all about enabling political participation. Even amendments, like the 18th Amendment in 2010, which devolved some powers, you can see that as trying to address concerns about too much power concentrated at the top. It echoes Dahl's concerns about those unequal distributions of influence we were talking about.
Right. But like Ojin points out, there's often this huge disconnect between the ideal and the reality. The military's enduring influence in Pakistani politics, for example, you won't find that spelled out in the Constitution, but it's this massive factor in how power actually works. And that's where the critical lens of political science is so important. It helps us dissect these tensions, these gaps between the formal and the informal, the way things are supposed to be and the way they actually are.
It's all about peeling back the layers. Political science gives us the tools to examine those informal power structures that operate alongside, sometimes even in opposition to, the official ones. It encourages us to see beyond the written rules and understand the underlying currents, those social, economic, and historical factors that truly shape how power is exercised.
Okay, so we've covered the origins and the scope. Now let's dig into how political science is intertwined with all these other social sciences, especially in the context of Pakistan. It's definitely not a field that exists in a vacuum.
No way. Political science has this, intricate dance with all these other disciplines, and each one brings its own unique perspective on how we govern ourselves. Let's start with law. It's a natural connection, especially when we're talking about constitutions. Thinkers like John Locke argued that the whole reason people even come together to form governments is to protect their property and rights. That directly links law to the very legitimacy of the state.
And Montesquieu takes that even further. He said that in a society governed by laws, freedom isn't just about doing whatever you want. It's about having the power to do what you should do and not being forced to do what you shouldn't. He saw law as the framework for both individual liberty and civic responsibility.
Exactly. And this theoretical link becomes really concrete when you look at case law. The American case Marbury's v. Madison is a perfect example. It established judicial review, the power of the courts to interpret the Constitution and decide whether laws are valid. As Chief Justice Marshall put it, it's the job of the judiciary to say what the law is.
And Ujjan John draws this awesome parallel to Pakistan. He points to Article 184 of the Constitution. It gives the Supreme Court suo motu powers, which means they can take action on their own initiative. He brings up the case Benazir Bhutto v. Federation of Pakistan in 1988, where the court played this key role in restoring democratic rights that fall under Article 17. It's a great illustration of how the legal system can be this political force, but also this crucial check on the power of the executive branch.
It's a two-way street, for sure. Now, shifting gears a little, let's look at political science and sociology. Max Weber's work on legitimate domination is super relevant here. He outlined these three types of legitimacy: rational legal authority based on laws and rules, traditional authority based on customs and inherited status, and charismatic authority based on the personal appeal of a leader. How do you see these different types of legitimacy playing out in Pakistan?
That's a really interesting question, especially when you consider the case Ujdan brings up, Zahiruddin v. State from 1993. It upheld restrictions on the Ahmadi community. And that ruling, it seems to prioritize a certain interpretation of traditional Islamic legitimacy over the rational legal principle of equality that's enshrined in Article 25 of the Constitution. It's a powerful example of how these deep-seated social and cultural norms, the stuff that sociologists study, can seriously influence how the law is interpreted and applied, and ultimately what political outcomes we get. What else can political science tell us about cases like this, where different forms of legitimacy seem to clash?
Well, political science, working alongside sociology, helps us understand how different sources of authority interact, sometimes collide. In the Zahiruddin case, you see this tension between the modern constitutional principle of equality and this more traditional, religiously based understanding of social order. Weber's framework allows us to see how different players, the judiciary, religious groups, the state itself, how they tap into and prioritize different sources of legitimacy. It's all part of their strategy. A criminologist might even look at how enforcing these kinds of restrictions can lead to marginalizing, even persecuting, minority groups.
It really underscores the point that the Constitution isn't just some abstract document. It exists within a society with its own very strong beliefs and power structures. Okay, let's turn to the intersection of political science and economics. Marx and Engels famously argued that the modern state is essentially a tool for managing the interests of the dominant economic class. Does that perspective hold water when we look at Pakistan?
It's a very thought-provoking lens. While thinkers like Lexanovsky push back on that, arguing that the state has a responsibility to all its citizens and can't ignore the economic foundations of society, the Marxist perspective forces us to ask, who really benefits from the government's policies? International agreements, like the Paris Climate Agreement, which tries to link economic development with environmental goals, they also highlight this inherent connection between political decisions and what happens in the economy. In Pakistan, you've got Article 38 of the Constitution, which focuses on promoting social and economic well-being, kind of echoes Lukansky's ideas. But a Marxist analysis, as Ujjan suggests, might ask, do Pakistan's economic policies really benefit everyone equally, or do they favor a select few? Public administration then becomes the arm of the state that has to implement these economic policies. And how effective is it? Well, we often judge that by how fairly resources are distributed.
Right, right. Last but not least, let's look at the connection between political science and history. It's impossible to truly understand how Pakistan is governed today without looking at its past, right? Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, described this hypothetical state of nature as pure chaos, everyone against everyone. He argued that you need a strong central authority to maintain order, prevent society from just collapsing. Does that idea resonate with Pakistan's historical development?
Hobbes' idea of the social contract, the need for a powerful sovereign to guarantee security, it's a theme that pops up again and again in the history of state building. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, that's a big one. It laid the groundwork for the way we think about states today, with their emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference. And that directly informs how Pakistan understands its own sovereignty, which is defined in Article 1 of its constitution.
And Ujjan brings up the case Mulvi Tamizuddin Khan v. Federation of Pakistan from 1955. A pivotal moment in Pakistan's early history. The Governor-General dissolved the Constituent Assembly, and initially, the courts upheld that decision. That case really shook the foundations of this young state and had a lasting impact on the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. You can see its influence in later constitutional provisions, like Article 48, which deals with emergency powers. History gives us the context to understand how these constitutional principles change over time and how power dynamics shift.
Totally. These historical precedents, whether it's foundational international agreements or these key legal battles within Pakistan, they continue to shape the political landscape and how we interpret the Constitution. They're full of lessons about how hard it is to build a state, the constant balancing act of power, and the enduring quest for stability and legitimacy. It never really ends.
So we've talked theory, we've looked at the big picture, and we've explored these fascinating interdisciplinary connections. Now let's get specific. How do concrete examples like court decisions and international treaties actually show political science in action in Pakistan?
That's where these abstract ideas become real, right?
Yeah.
Take the Magna Carta. It's not part of Pakistan's legal system, but it embodies some core political science principles. It's big on due process, this idea that you can't just take away someone's rights without a fair trial. That echoes strongly in Article 4 of Pakistan's constitution, which guarantees the right to be treated according to the law. Now contrast that with the Simla Agreement, a treaty between India and Pakistan aimed at resolving conflicts peacefully. It's a classic example of realist international relations theory. National interest and the balance of power are what matters most.
So both of them aim for stability, in a way. The Magna Carta is focused on social order within a state, while the Simla Agreement is about peace between states. But one emphasizes individual rights and the rule of law, while the other is driven by those pragmatic realities of international politics. How much power do you have on the world stage? That kind of thing.
Exactly. Now compare the Treaty of Versailles with Pakistan's own post-colonial constitution. Huge difference. Versailles, imposed by the victors after World War I, it reflected their interests and power dynamics. They imposed mandates, reshaped the map, the whole 9 yards. It was about power, plain and simple. Pakistan's constitution in Article 3 specifically rejects exploitation. It's a stark contrast. Political science helps us analyze Versailles as this exercise of power by the strong over the weak. Pakistan's constitution, at least in its stated goals, tries to gain legitimacy through principles of fairness and equality. Aligns with thinkers like Lasuksaski, who believed the state should protect its people from exploitation. But as Ujjan points out, the fact that inequality persists in Pakistan raises serious questions about how effective those ideals really are. That's something public administration grapples with constantly. How do you translate those ideals into action?
And, of course, we can't forget judicial review. From Marbury v. Madison setting the precedent to how it's applied in Pakistan, cases like Benazir Bhutto v. Federation of Pakistan show how courts are major players on the political stage. They're interpreting the Constitution, setting limits on the government's power. It's fascinating to see how it plays out.
From a political science perspective, and especially thinking about scholars who study how judges make decisions, judicial review, even suo motu actions, can be analyzed not just as a legal function, but as a form of political engagement. As Ujjan suggests, it's this vital safeguard for constitutional rights, but it can also be a form of judicial activism, which can impact the balance of power between different branches of government. Law and political science definitely overlap here in a big way.
It's like Pakistan's constitution is this incredible dynamic document where all these different strands of political science are constantly weaving in and out. The tension between power and justice, the clash between ideals and what you can actually achieve, this constant struggle for legitimacy, it's all there.
Absolutely. The 1973 Constitution, in the way it allocates power, defines the state, lays out fundamental rights. It touches on so many core concerns of political science. You see echoes of Aristotle's questions about what makes a good society, Machiavelli's insights into how to get and keep power, Weber's framework for understanding different types of authority. And as we've been discussing, all these core political science concepts are constantly being shaped and reinterpreted through the lenses of law, sociology, economics, you name it.
It's a living, breathing document. For someone like Farman Ali Ujjan, who's studying law, it's like this amazing laboratory for political science, a case study in this never-ending effort to reconcile those grand ideals of how a society should work with the messy reality of governing in a world that's, well, incredibly complex.
It's a constant process. Interpretation, adaptation, negotiation, it's all influenced by the historical context, changing social norms, economic pressures, legal precedents. There's so many factors in play. Understanding Pakistan's constitution through this political science lens, it just gives you a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of the country's past, its present, and the paths it might take in the future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Pakistan's constitution through this fascinating lens of political science, we've seen how this fundamental document really embodies those core tensions at the heart of the field. That constant push and pull between the pursuit of justice and the realities of power, and the dialogue between these idealistic visions for a nation and the pragmatic challenges of governing in the real world. We've explored how the enduring ideas of thinkers like Aristotle, Machiavelli, Lasky, and Weber give us these valuable frameworks for understanding how the Constitution came to be, how it distributes power, and the different ways it tries to establish legitimacy.
And it's so important to remember just how interconnected everything is. We've seen how the principles of law, especially judicial review, shape how the Constitution is interpreted. Think Marbury v. Madison, and its echoes in Pakistan, with Benazir Bhutto v. Federation of Pakistan. Sociology helps us understand the social forces at play, like in the Zahiruddin case and Weber's theories of authority. Economics shows light on the material conditions and the policies that the Constitution is trying to address. We talked about Article 38 and the critical perspectives offered by Marxist thought. Even global agreements like the Paris Climate Accord come into play. And history, of course, provides that essential backdrop, from the fundamental principles of treaties like Westphalia to the lessons learned from crucial cases like Mulvi Tamizuddin Khan v. Federation of Pakistan. Even specific developments within Pakistan's constitution, like the Objectives Resolution and the 18th Amendment, they're all products of these interwoven forces. It's a tapestry, really.
So, with this constant interplay of political science concepts within Pakistan's constitutional framework, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities as it evolves, as it tries to strike that balance between the ideals of justice and the realities of power? It really makes you think about how these same principles apply not just to Pakistan, but to any system of government around the world that's wrestling with the complexities of legitimacy and stability in a world that's constantly changing.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that will keep political scientists, legal scholars, sociologists, economists, historians, all of them busy for generations to come.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll wrap things up here. Thanks for joining me for another deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.
My pleasure. Always love a good deep dive.
Until next time.